Here is a staggering statistic. 1 in 5 people in America are diagnosed as neurodivergent. And you may not know that this often overlooked segment of the population can actually bring lots of value and expertise to organizations who happen to be struggling in the war on talent. There is a large untapped pool of perfectly capable employees who can get overlooked by HR screening processes or excluded by organizations that don't accommodate people with disabilities. Big mistake, says Susanne Bruyère, who is a professor of disability studies and academic director at Cornell's Yang Institute. Susanne makes a strong case for why we should all pursue neurodiversity-affirmative hiring initiatives if we haven't done so already. Neurodiverse hiring programs have proven successful among the most visible champions of diverse hiring. We'll look at how best-in-practice recruiters are handling screening, selection, orientation, on-the-job training, and preparatory supervisor and workforce training for neurodiverse employees, and you can apply all of this to your own organization. So check out the episode notes for links to courses in Building a Diverse Workforce, Workplace Disability Inclusion, and Neurodiversity at Work courses. Lots of useful resources for both employees and employers here. Here is my conversation with Susanne. Susanne, let's level set the conversation a little bit with a striking statistic. 1 in 5 people are diagnosed or self-identify as either autistic or neurodivergent. That's a pretty striking statistic. Tell us how we arrived at this figure.
Thanks for that very good baseline question, Chris. Those are U.S. statistics.
Okay.
That's what we have right now. We do think that they're generalizable to other parts of the globe for sure, where we know those data is collected. But in the U.S., the Centers for Disease Control does collect data, and we have data going back 20 years. So we know in the broader group, if you talk beyond autism, including other people with what we call neurodiverse characteristics, it is approximately 1 in 5.
Can we explain, and to further baseline and level set here, can we explain what we mean by autism versus neurodiversity? Where's the overlap? Does one, fit into a subcategory of the other?
Yes, that's an excellent question. And right now, we do use a broader umbrella. These terminology is always changing, but I think we recognize that we'll all be well served, individuals who identify in this category, family members, and the general population, by thinking about neurodiversity as the umbrella term.
Sure.
For a variety of different characteristics, people that have different conditions that we know to be autism being one of them, and that group, the numbers have grown, according to the CDC statistics, significantly over the 20 years since they've kept them, but also includes ADHD, attention deficit disorder, hyperactivity disorder, dyscalculia, which is difficulty with numbers, dyslexia, which is reading and writing comprehension, which most of us are familiar with, dyspraxia, which can be motion impacted, and Tourette's syndrome. So there are others as well, but that I think helps. Those are terms that many people know that I think helps us to understand. We're talking about a broad umbrella, although we have focused originally on autism. It's this bigger picture now that we're really talking about, which is approximately 20% of the U.S. population.
So language is important. I've asked you to help me and help our audience talk about this properly, right? There's ways of going about this as we discuss. And of course, we're all works in progress. We all learn, how to work better with each other, ideally, through age and experience. Help me with the language a little bit, because there's some good ways and useful ways and instructive ways to talk about how we talk about neurodivergence and autism especially.
Yes, absolutely. And really the community itself of self-advocates with autism and with neurodiversity more broadly are the ones who are educating us in lots and lots of ways. The term neurodiversity was coined by a woman, Judy Singer, and we've embraced that because it's a nice way to think more broadly about differences that are naturally occurring in the human condition. Differences the way we are wired and the way that wiring is expressed through our social behaviors and other kind of conditions is a natural part of the human phenomenon. They're different in these different conditions that we're talking about. For autism, for example, it might be social and communication ways, other behavioral differences that people are experiencing. We hear from the autism community that that many people in that group like to use what we call identity first language rather than person first language. We have evolved in the disability community more broadly from thinking about what we thought was a more respectful way of talking about people, saying people with disabilities, and now self-advocates in the disability community, and this has been embraced in the autism community, say, no, I am proud of my disability identity. I am not just a person with a disability, I'm a disabled person. The same kind of preference we're seeing in the autism community. I am an autistic individual, autistic with a capital A. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a wonderful thing for us to understand. And when we're interacting with people who identify that way openly, ask them for their preference and how they'd like to characterize their identity.
So why are a growing number of companies designing and implementing affirmative hiring practices to recruit individuals who are either neurodivergent or autistic? What's the driver here?
The driver is need for talent. I mean, it's always true that business is looking for the very best talent imaginable to meet their strategic imperative. And it's never been more true than now. And we've seen over the past 10 years, in some cases longer, there were early pioneers, even earlier pioneers in this area, but particularly the tech sector seemed to take an ardent interest about 10 years ago. There were leaders like SAP, Microsoft, finance industry, JP Morgan Chase, and others that certainly said, this seems to be an area, a discovering of certain characteristics in autistic people, like ability to see patterns, in some cases beyond what many people were able to observe. Great for data, great for cybersecurity, great for accounting anomalies.
Prolonged focus.
Yeah. Absolutely. And what many of us might find tedious, not necessarily ability to really stay and hang in there in very detailed types of tasks. These are amazing characteristics for certain jobs, and it was identified, and then an ardent search for the talent that had these characteristics began in certain sectors, particularly starting with certain companies.
This seems to be an untapped talent pool. That's the case, right? And, we mentioned the tech sector and maybe some others, but this kind of applies more broadly, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And I'm delighted to be able to say that we do see many, many more industries interested. Those skill sets and others in this population of neurodivergent, autistic individuals can apply to many jobs in many sectors. And there is a growing number, if people are interested in that. There's an organization that is a collection of employers who are interested in workplace disability inclusion, and a subset of that is a roundtable that is called the Neurodiversity at Work Roundtable, sponsored by Disability In. And we have that link for you. And that is, I think, approximately now 4 to 5 dozen different companies from different sectors and different sizes. This started out in large sector, large industries. So there's a lot more variety of opportunity for people who are interested in promoting themselves as potential job candidates or supporting individuals who are interested in doing so.
So let's think about the hiring process itself. I'm thinking about employees, employers, potential candidates. I was curious, given current tech, I know that there's a lot of automation built into hiring processes. AI is figuring into some of this frontline screening kind of stuff. How do we ensure that we're not excluding people with neurodivergence, autism, et cetera? How do we ensure that we're not excluding anybody and making sure that it's an inclusive environment? Is there anything we could do about that in these frontline screening processes?
Yeah, that's one area we have ardently focused. Our interest is the interview process, because we know from self-report and from the report of employers, many people with these neurodivergent characteristics can be lost in that process.
Sure.
So there are several things we recommend. First of all, before people even get in your door in the interview process, is making sure you frame your website in a way that is attracting people, letting them know they're wanted, whether that's particular application portals that are just for neurodivergent or autistic people, internships, flagging the fact that you're neurodiversity inclusive as an employer so people will even apply. But we also encourage employers to not just use the AI process, but enter a human element in that process, particularly where you can identify applicants who might be neurodiverse or autistic. And then once you get them in that pool, that pipeline, is look at your interview process, because we may be needlessly there losing people because we have a protocol that's very high anxiety producing, such as panel interviews, long days, ambiguous questions. All of that, I think, can be reframed and more neurodiversity friendly.
I suspect that we have a lot of work, and I'm speaking generally, that companies have a lot of work to do in this space. You live in this world. From where you sit, you have a pretty good view. Are we doing okay? Do we have a long way to go? It's an ideal that we may never reach, but how are we doing so far?
Well, I would say, I can't speak to the many thousands of companies we have in the U.S., of course, but I can tell you, and it's been wonderful to observe, that in the companies who have been leaders in this area, we know this because they have iterated over 10 years and tried a variety of different things to look for success in getting applicants, qualified applicants, through that pipeline and into their interview process and then into the hiring process. And some of the things I've shared with you is because we've observed that in these more progressive companies. A lot of them have moved toward demonstration of skills rather than having to verbally describe your skill set. And that has proved very useful in identifying people who really are good matches for these jobs and longer term success in staying in the jobs once they get hired.
What are some challenges in the employment process? And this goes beyond that frontline thing that we were just talking about, but how can we better design and implement neurodiversity affirmative hiring initiatives? Bigger picture kind of stuff, not necessarily the tactical, how do we get people in the door, but how do you make this part of the workplace culture?
That's a terrific question, because it has to start even before what I just described to you as getting people in the front door. And that is letting your workplace know that this is a business imperative. So the first thing we say is set that culture. You used the right word when you talked about that. It's having top management say, here's what we're going to be doing. This is a part of the strategic business imperative for talent. We want neurodiverse people, neurodivergent people, autistic people in our workplace. We are going to have an affirmative hiring program. To make this a success, we need your help. We need your help as a workforce. We need your help as parents and family members of people. Send them to us if they're qualified for our jobs. But help us build a culture where people will be accepted and be able to thrive. And hopefully have supervisors step forward who say, I have jobs. I'm willing to work with this talent to help them be the match we want them to be.
You had mentioned in some of the notes here in our conversation earlier that establishing community partnerships is probably a good idea. What does that look like? I need clarity on that.
It's very critical, Chris, because you may say you're successful in sending this messaging, right? Then you need your talent pipeline to be built. And you certainly can promote this on your career pages and portal, but people may not find you and know that you're ardently in search. Working with community service providers or national and regional and state networks of organizations that are actually supporting this talent and trying to make that bridge between colleges, high schools, vocational technical schools, and workplaces, that will significantly heighten the likelihood that you'll find that talent pool you're looking for.
Let's get into it a little bit more. I want to understand, and maybe this exists, maybe it doesn't, but what would be some KPIs, some key performance indicators, metrics or analytics that you would use to measure the success or the efficacy of a program, its success or failure? Running an assessment, how are we doing with this?
Well, some of the things I really already mentioned to you is just saying, did we do it? And what first is, do you have top leadership commitment? And is it evident? I mean, it's fine for the president or CEO or chairman of the board to say, great idea. It's another to have explicitly made a statement about that on your website. It's a part of your messaging internally. It's a part of your messaging externally, part of your brand. Is that being done? First metric. Secondly, do you have those community partnerships? Third, are they sourcing qualified candidates? Do you have the right partners? And if those candidates are in your pipeline, how many of them are getting through the interview process? How many of them are getting hired? And what proportion is that of your general hiring protocol and population? And then looking at once in, is there equity in terms of advancement and retention? If you're losing people who are a part of this neurodivergent pool in higher proportion, that's a signal, right? We don't have the climate or culture we want for them to be valued and retained.
So I'm thinking that this is a callback to our original research stat, which is the 1 in 5 Americans identify as or are diagnosed as neurodivergent or autistic or what have you. What about the people among our workforce currently, right? So I've been at my job a little bit. You have too. I haven't been assessed for this kind of thing. And I don't know if this should be part of business practice. My thinking is yes, because you had mentioned that you want to understand to what degree are we retaining people who are neurodivergent.
Well, I think that's a great question. We do want to know. And the reality of it is that neurodiversity isn't necessarily evident or visible, right?
Yeah.
So people have to feel comfortable. This is where the culture that you talked about or climate is really important. If people don't feel that that's a positive thing, that there are stereotypes or stigmas that are going to stamp them if they self-disclose, they're not going to come forward.
Yep.
That's addressed differently if you have a pipeline where people have already self-disclosed. But we have many people. If it's 1 in 5 of the American population, we know they're among the workforce now, and many of them may not have felt historically comfortable coming forward. That means we can't do as good a job as we perhaps could in accommodating people, in helping them to thrive, in helping them to be comfortable and feel proud of who they are. So we have a long way to go in that regard. But it does start with people feeling like they can say who they are and get what they need to be fully embraced by the organization and be productive to the extent they are able to be.
Self-disclosure has been a huge issue in my work with people who work in the disability space within Cornell and, out in industry. But that's a whole topic. We could probably get into that maybe at a later date. But within the disability community and employers, self-disclosure is like a huge challenge.
It's a significant challenge, particularly for those employers who have to do that as a part of their regulatory requirements.
Yeah. So let's break down some best in practices, how recruiters are handling screening, selection, orientation, onboarding kind of stuff, on-job training. What does this look like when it's working at a highly functional organization that has implemented a disability hiring strategy, affirmative strategy, like we've been kind of idealizing through this conversation?
Yes. Well, we've certainly talked about some of the good practices, these community partnerships, the articulating as a part of the business strategy, training for supervisors and hiring managers, training for recruiters, and then support systems built in. And certainly we've seen many companies try different things. They may have job coaches from these community organizations. Many of them are establishing mentoring programs, which is very helpful, or buddy systems. There is so much in workplaces that is sort of an informal network and socialization. So it's cueing people into where do you go, who do you talk to if you want advancement, if you want stretch assignments, if you want, to broaden how you view the company. That takes mentoring, that takes, and maybe just natural socialization that sometimes we see these social buddies assigned to people to help them know where's the cafeteria and where do your teammates go on Friday at 5:00 for a TGIF, and how do you insert yourself and get joining into that. So we see those climates being built, also more formal systems around employee assistance program supports. It might be, workstation supports that your health and safety unit does. There's a lot of naturally occurring internal organizational supports that can be captured to support, but you have to educate them. You have to bring them on board. It's a part of that messaging again.
In the notes, we also have that employee-driven affinity organizational kind of things that happen organically. First of all, there has to be a culture that not allows for that, but,
encourages.
I find that really interesting too, right? Because that comes with the sort of self-disclosure kind of thing in its own way.
Absolutely. And we've seen it historically been more often used for race, ethnicity, gender supports, building those alliances up with people with like interests. No different for people who are neurodivergent. One of the things as we've seen successful, heightens the likelihood of success since self-identification can be an issue, is designing these with the idea that it's not just people who self-identify, it is also for allies. We see that in other groups as well, but this is certainly true here. Family members, you may have a child, you may have a sibling, you may have a spouse who has these characteristics, and being in the conversation can be very supportive.
So what about our viewers who want to take action, right? What are the next steps here? We're thinking about HR managers, people that are involved in HR, but also, throughout the organization, especially the C-suite. We've got a lot of work to do there also. What are some of the first steps that people can take? Naturally, we had talked about your certificate program, the Autism at Work course that you're working to update, or you've been shooting this week. Thanks for making time for this. What would be some good, sensible, logical next steps for people that want to take action based on what we've talked about here?
Yes, I think there are a number. I think if you're a family member and you're concerned about getting resources for your child, perhaps, or your teen, I think there are those resources in the community. There are many national organizations. I think banding with other parents is very helpful. I think as within the workplace, we have originally targeted our courses for HR professionals. We see many broader interest areas of workplace professionals coming to us, DEI folks, EEO folks. Wherever you are situated, you have a contribution to make. And so what I would encourage people to think about is it's just raising awareness that this is a population that can be a talent source, that the community often has representation in it that you can align with, and also looking at how to establish some naturally occurring communities within your workforce to help understand who's interested and what place would they like to serve in raising visibility about this, like these employee resource or affinity groups. Great place to start that conversation.
Perfect. And I've got a really good question from a viewer, Susan, who checks in and says, to you, Susanne, what career advice do you have for an autistic person who doesn't display the pseudo-savant characteristics, hyperfocus, pattern recognition, etc., but whose primary divergence is just struggling with social cues? Tell us a little bit about that. I mean, we're getting specific here, but I was really interested in the employee side questions.
Oh, Susan, thank you for raising your question. It is not an uncommon question. It's a really great question. And I would say you should, first of all, like all of us, find out what your passion is, really think about what it is you want to do and get the skill set that you want, that you think you might need for that. That's the place to start, is not necessarily looking for the job that will accept you, but more, what is the type of job you want? Because you want to speak from a position of being qualified for the job. And then I think, like any of us in this interview process, we need to practice skills to get through that interview experience. Look for the cues I talked about on the website of the companies that you're interested in or the jobs you're interested in. Look for a more inclusive environment to start with. That's a good place to try your skills out and rehearse those skills for the interview process. And then when you get into the organization, hopefully you're in the right place, in the right climate, where you talk about what you need to get to the interface with your colleagues and perhaps with customers, where you can build your social skills with supports around you. That's how I would say you can marry your interests, your talents, with a workplace that will embrace you and support you.
Good one. Thank you, Susan. We have a question from Monty, who asks, I've always heard that you should never divulge your neurodiversity in the workplace because of the stigma and misconceptions that will hurt you more than help. How do you demonstrate openness and understanding in the workplace to combat this? No short answer.
No short answer. It's an ongoing issue for people of all kinds of differences, not just neurodiversity. Here we're focused on neurodiversity. I do think, it's testing the culture. It's watching and observing around you. Certainly you want to be in an environment, we've talked about that culture. Look for cues of places and people you can begin to open up and share about yourself. I think try to be an advocate for this inclusion in your own environment by building allies, not necessarily with disclosing, but eventually I think it's important to find a network of people inside your workplace and external to your workplace where you can fully be yourself and then back that into that work environment, because we need people to help us change what has historically been overly stigmatizing for not only neurodiverse people, but other people with differences in the workplace.
I've got a two-part question where I'm going to combine what JT asks with what I'm going to ask. Here we go. So if it's 1 in 5 people with neurodivergence or autism, what was it 10 years ago or more? Has something changed? We had mentioned this in the beginning, and I think it's worth kind of reiterating. It's the increase in diagnoses. It's the attention paid to it within the medical community and without, right?
Well, we think so. We don't know for sure, Chris.
Okay.
Yes, I don't think I gave the specific statistic, but the CDC, I said it was collecting data over 20 years. We diagnosed, at that time, the CDC diagnosed 1 in 158-year-old children were diagnosed with autism. This is specifically autism. And 2 years ago, that was the most recent statistic that came out in 2023, but it's 2020 data, 1 in 36 8-year-old children. So that's a significant increase in prevalence rates over a 20-year period. We don't know if it is a higher incidence, truly. It's more awareness. It's better diagnosis. I think more parents are thinking about this and bringing their children to have assessments where we haven't historically. And we know many adults now, when they see these characteristics being diagnosed in their children, themselves realize that some of these characteristics their terrific children have are in them as well. And so they may go and get diagnosed. So we're getting educated front and back here, up and down. And I think that's certainly part of it, but we don't know entirely why that is changing.
I think I'm encouraged by the cultural destigmatization of this. To begin with, more people identifying, more people seeing characteristics that are familiar to them in their coworkers, from within their families or whatever. I think I'm encouraged by some of the developments that you've discussed today and some of the actionable steps that we can also take as employees, employers, HR managers, et cetera.
Yes.
Yeah, so I appreciate you coming in today to the studio to get us set up on this. Susanne Bruyère, lovely to have you.
Great to be here. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks for listening to Cornell Keynotes. Check out the episode notes for information on our courses in building a diverse workforce, workplace disability inclusion, and neurodiversity at work. Thank you again, friends, for listening, and subscribe to stay in touch.